Welcome to The Way Left. This podcast is Vote, Equal Rights. So, as a reminder to all that listen to this podcast is obviously on Spotify, and it is also out there under videos on YouTube. And then there's also shorts on YouTube. YouTube has been a good platform to look at shorts, things that we kind of call magic episodes out of the podcast that kind of speak to specific topics in a shorter format, not the long form of a general podcast. So just a reminder, also a reminder to go to thewayleft.com and go under recommendations, go under podcasts. You'll see all the podcasts out there, and there's no gating to it or paywall. And under recommendations or the blog, which I'll reference today, are good things on speeches, books to read, videos. What are you watching? What are you listening to? What are you reading? And the blog has some good quotes and reference to materials from the IMF, International Monetary Fund, or the WHO, World Health Organization. So good resources. Again, read or listen or watch, but do all three. I always press for reading because I think the mind captures more that way. And read different books. If you're going to read religiously, read all the books. Read the Torah. Read Buddhist philosophies. Read the Bible. All of which are probably not fun reads, but it's a good historical context. If you're going to read authors, read many authors. If you're going to read politics, read some left, read some right, from economists, from political scientists, from right wing to left wing. So again, read, read, read. And if you don't have time to read because you're listening to my podcast or other podcasts, then go read and you can come back to the podcast because it's always out there. Remember, the internet is forever, it seems. Everything's out there. And then when you look, there's nothing out there. Okay. I don't think this is going to be a long podcast, but what I wanted to talk about, and there's some of this going on in the courts right now, is I want to talk about voting and how important that is. And essentially, it's taxation with representation. If you're an individual in this country, or any country for that matter, that actually has a voting process, unlike dictatorships or quasi-autocracies, Russia, even Hungary with Orban, Maduro in Venezuela, North Korea, China for that matter, where they really don't have the rights of the people. They don't really have the Declaration of Independence, the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, the Bill of Rights, and the amendments to be able to have the luxury to vote for people that represent us. And a lot of times we don't feel like they represent us. And that's not okay, but it's okay. You still need to vote. When you say my vote doesn't count, then you're giving up. Now, you'll say I'm in a red state and I'm a Democrat, so I don't want to vote. That vote still matters. It still gives you a voice. So vote. So what we're going to talk about is access to voting, the history of limited access, and then I'm going to reference some things from the blog on the website that you can also look up, some references to Abraham Lincoln, Martin Luther King Jr., and then there are also others under there from Harriet Tubman, who fought to get slaves out of the South, from Frederick Douglass, who led the march against slavery, but also the rights of man. They said men are all created equal. Should have been humans, Americans, women and men of all colors, religious persuasion. But it didn't. It said all men were created equal, were created equal based on that. The point being here is you need to vote. You need to think about it. Have some references. You don't have to dive into CNN or to MS Now, which used to be MSNBC or ABC or Fox or Newsmax. But it's good to have a perspective of what's going on in your city, what's going on in your state, and then even at the federal level. It's hard to avoid Trump, the orange-ass clown, and what he's saying. Not all that comes out of every side is bad. There are good things about all of it. We need to understand it. But the main power we have is our voice and our vote. So let's talk about that. We're going to go into the Voting Rights Act of 1965. I'm also going to reference some amendments that have been done in the Constitution because we really didn't treat all men and especially women and those of color and minorities as equals. But the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was really put into place, and I'll reference MLK Jr.'s "I Have a Dream" speech here in a minute. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was a landmark U.S. federal statute that prohibits racial discrimination in voting. This will lead into my discussion about gerrymandering, which we'll get to. Signed into law by LBJ in 1965, August 6, 1965. Congress later amended the act five times to expand its protection. So basically what this was doing is enforce voting rights, protected by the 14th and 15th Amendment. So what are the 14th and 15th Amendments? And this is all things that are going on now. So the 14th Amendment, now remember the Bill of Rights was the first 10, and then we have 11 through 27, and you can reference my podcast, 27 Amendments, Do We Know Them? The 14th Amendment, Citizenship and Equal Protection, 1868. Birthright citizenship. States must give due process and equal protection. What is birthright citizenship? And this is a big thing now with the immigration policies and ICE coming down, and they're trying to fight against this. So, I'm an Italian. I live in Italy. I moved to America with my wife. We have a kid here in America. That kid gets birthright citizenship based on our Constitution and the 14th Amendment. Now, the argument now is that illegals are coming in, having babies here so they get protection so they can stay. I'm not going to say that's right or wrong. I have my opinions on that. But for the matter of the voting, we are sticking to the 14th Amendment. And what that means is if you are born here and you're a citizen you are a citizen of the United States of America, you can also become a citizen if you're an immigrant and get your citizenship. Now, you can't run for president because you weren't born in America, but you can still get your citizenship. So there's a lot of ways to go about getting your citizenship beyond visa or green card status. That isn't for this discussion. The 15th Amendment is the right to vote not denied by race. Okay? That was put in place in 1870. So essentially, this was meant not by race. Notice how it doesn't say by sex. It says by race. What that was speaking to especially was blacks from slavery. And that was after the Civil War. It was actually passed after Lincoln's death. And that was right to vote not denied by race. Amendment 15, 1870. So when we go back to the Voting Rights Act, they're referencing specifically that we've got to stick to these 2 points. Now remember, we're basically 100 years from 1868, 1870 to 1965 that they had to put this Voting Rights Act into place because of what really was going on in the South. And in the South, there was obviously segregation, the civil rights movement, as I get to Martin Luther King Jr. There was ways to restrict those of minorities, poor, white, and black, to not vote, to control the vote. So they had to come up with something. Obviously, people thought well of it. Some people will argue that Republicans fought harder than Democrats on this. It was a Democratic president that was first led by JFK when he was president before he was assassinated, in conjunction with Martin Luther King and John Lewis's and all the civil rights advocates that pushed for this to be passed by President Lyndon B. Johnson. An important piece of legislation. A lot of people say it was the most significant statutory change in the relationship between the federal and state governments in the area of voting since the Reconstruction period after the Civil War. What happened in the Reconstruction period after the Civil War? The 14th and 15th Amendments. The 14th Amendment, birthright citizenship. The 15th Amendment, vote by race. So they put this in place because they noticed that things were not going well. Obviously, in the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement. Those civil rights obviously were pushed more from the standpoint of the black population through MLK, but he was fighting for all people. I will quote his 1963 I Have a Dream speech. This is 1963. This is less than 100 years after the end of the Civil War, and he has to have this speech. So think about that. It's the creed of the United States. And I will summarize here. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Again, we use men. That should be synonymous with men, women, and all colors, created equal. Equal rights, voting rights, taxation with representation to determine who represents us in our republic, in our democracy, in our city, in our state, in our federal government, in the House of Representatives, in the Senate. Okay. That's the Voting Rights Act. Now, currently, that's being discussed, and I'm going to probably discuss this on another podcast about a few court cases that I feel that a lot of people feel, not just myself, are impinging on the Voting Rights Act and other things of that nature. There is a persuasion here, and John Roberts has pushed for this, is that this isn't the 1960s and that racism has dissipated and that we should do away with the Voting Rights Act. Okay, it isn't an amendment, it is a law. So they still have the power to go back and shift that, even based on the fact that we still have the 14th and 15th Amendment in place. I will get to that in deeper dive in another podcast. The broader point here is that all men are created equal. What MLK wanted to see, MLK Jr., Martin Luther King Jr., wanted to see, his vision is that we all hold hands, that we are all equal. And so from a conservative standpoint, we are now, I guess, 50 years after the 60s, 55 or more years, that we're all equal and that nobody is messing with voter suppression. Nobody is messing with gerrymandering districts based on race, and that we don't need a Voting Rights Act because all men are created equal and all things are equal. And taxation and representation is equal across the board for poor, for blacks, for minorities, for women, for disabled. I would argue with that. I think we need some variation. To rid it is to assume we're in a place that race doesn't matter. I would hope to be in that place, but I think we know we're not yet. And for the poor, white, black, green, or blue, and for minorities, and for women, I think we need some controls in place. We'll see how it falls out with the Supreme Court. I'm going to move on to voter suppression and gerrymandering. So the 24th Amendment of the U.S. Constitution was the abolition of poll tax. Okay? So there was a poll tax that was put in place that basically said, hey, if you want to vote, you have to pay to vote, right? You have to pay. The southern states of the former Confederate States of America, so again, we're going a long way back. We're going 100 years back because this was put together. The poll tax rescission was put together in, what did I say? 1964. So 100 years, 99 after the end of the Civil War. They put in a poll tax, and again, in the South, and again, at that point in time, it was really a lot of Southern Democrats. Okay. Both in their state laws and their state constitutions throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This became more widespread as the Democratic Party regained control of most levels of government in the South in the decades after Reconstruction. The purpose of poll taxes, some people would argue this, was to prevent African Americans and poor whites from voting. It was held to be constitutional in 1937 by the Supreme Court. So we can talk about poll taxes. So, for example, it's either Australia or New Zealand that you actually pay if you don't vote after you file a tax. It's like an automatic contribution that you have to make if you don't vote. That's kind of a poll tax. The issue with a poll tax, and especially what they did in the South, the Democratic Party, sickening, was to exclude those who couldn't afford to do it. Now, it might have been really cheap, but remember, the poor. And that was excluding both whites and minorities. So this just wasn't a racist thing. This was, let's eliminate a lot of the people that may not vote us in. Okay? I can make arguments to say, I agree with the Australian or New Zealand, I'd have to look it up, that require you to vote or you pay a small fine. Because not only do you have a voice, you're obligated to use that voice. And if you choose not to, then you should contribute to the freedoms that you get, even without taxation with representation, even without participation. The issue with the poll tax is it's used politically to reduce the population that votes. So therefore, I'm going to lean towards ridding that or requiring that. But I would push all people to vote, no matter what, for whoever. Trump, libertarians, whatever you want. It's a free country, but vote. So you have knowledge. Politics affects your life, whether you like it or not. It affects your streets. It affects your schools. It affects your utility bills. So vote. So in the end, when I heard about the Australia and New Zealand, again, I can clarify that, I was like, yeah, people should have to pay a fine for not, and maybe a minimal fine. But again, that's a regressive tax. It hits the poor worse. So then they would go vote. But if they don't, so you do still have a choice. So getting rid of the poll tax, the 24th Amendment, 100 years later, was a good idea because then you can't, what I'll get to next, gerrymander the election as much by restricting those that can't afford to vote. There were 5 states that retained the poll tax when that amendment came into place: Alabama, Arkansas, Mississippi, Texas, and Virginia. So it stated that these violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. Subsequent litigation related to potential discriminatory effects or voter registration requirements has generally been based on application of this clause. So obviously the poll tax in general was discriminatory of voter registration, discriminatory against the poor and against minorities. Lots of whites included in that. So this wasn't necessarily a race issue. I'm sure there were some race elements. This was, let's get people out from voting so that we can control. Now, before we get into gerrymandering, let's talk about a few other amendments that are important for this pod. I will also bring up that you should reference Frederick Douglass, who talks about the end of slavery, and that gets us to the point of the 15th Amendment, right to vote not denied by race during the Civil War. Also, there's Susan B. Anthony, who was one of many female advocates that fought for the women's right to vote. And that was established with the 19th Amendment in 1920. Other amendments that affect voting. In 1913, we actually had direct election of senators. Direct election meaning we could vote on senators. Before that, it was not direct through the voters. The 22nd Amendment, 2-term limit for presidents. This came after World War II, and this is obviously a hot topic now with Trump saying he's going to run for a third one, and Steve Bannon says there's a ways around it, because what happens in that case is you get away from democracy when you don't run elections. And you have powers that maybe you shouldn't have. And that all come from FDR, who went into a 4th term from the early 30s to the mid 40s before he passed, and Harry Truman became president. So they put in an amendment rightfully so, 2-term limit for presidents. Voting in D.C., the District of Columbia, is not a state, should be. They didn't have the right to vote till 1961. So that was taxation without representation. Crazy. And again, abolition of poll tax, 1964. Also an amendment, and this goes back to the Voting Rights Act and talking about how we have to be concerned about ways to manipulate based on race or, for that matter, being poor, voter suppression. 25th Amendment, presidential succession and disability. Clarifies succession and process if president is incapacitated. So we didn't have a succession plan for the president. Now it goes to the vice president, then to the leader of the House, then to the Secretary of State, then to the Secretary of Defense, which is now called the Secretary of War for the time being, because what we want to be known as is warmongers instead of defending our country. That's our Pete Hegseth, if you can imagine. And the final amendment that I'll reference here, voting age lowered to 18 in 1971. So people were going to war for years, tens, 100 years, 150 years, that couldn't vote, but they were less than 18 going to war. Lots of people went to war. My dad went in, he didn't go to war, but he went to the Navy in 1962 at 17 and a half. He couldn't vote, but he could defend his country. So crazy. But 1971, the year after I was born, now you can be 18 and you can vote. A lot of people say, well, they're too young. They're humans. It's their life. Maybe they will have radical ideas, but we need ideas and we need people to participate. Taxation with representation. A lot of 17, 18-year-olds work. A lot of them pay taxes. Taxation with representation. Okay. So we move on from that. We've gone from Voting Rights Act, which is current, going on, testing it. The right is fighting to get rid of it completely with the Supreme Court. It's kind of twisted. So the Voting Rights Act was put into place and the voter suppression was put into place, poll tax removed because of what the Democrats were doing in the South. Now we want to remove them because of what the Republicans are doing in the South. So you see, it isn't a Republican or Democrat issue. It's a power issue. It's a political issue. So this might be the way left, but I'm not going to sit back and take fodder from anybody, whether that's Democrats, Republicans, socialists, extremists, libertarians. If you're doing something to infringe on our freedoms, our Bill of Rights, our liberalism, our right to vote, taxation with representation, then I have a problem. Okay. Gerrymandering. Okay. This is a manipulation of electoral district boundaries to advantage a party group or socioeconomic class within your group. Boy, I can't get that word out. So gerrymandering has been around since the beginning of the Republic. And I'm not going to go into all the history here. But basically what this does is they call it cracking, diluting the voting power of the opposing party supporters across many districts, or packing, concentrating the opposing party's voting power of one district to reduce their voting in other districts. Gerrymandering can also be used to protect incumbents being somebody that's there, they want to keep them there, their base has changed, so let's gerrymander that district so they win that district again, Republican or Democrat. The Republicans and Democrats have both done this. This is a institutional problem. This should be changed by law or an amendment. And we can talk about some of those ideas I'm going to have at the end of this podcast. Gerrymandering also comes into voter suppression, comes into voting rights. So right now we have a lot of gerrymandering going on. Gerrymandering's always gone on, and generally gerrymandering has gone on when the census comes in. The census is every 10 years. But now that's all gone. You have the push by Trump and his cronies because of the pressure of his falling approval rate and losing these elections of late, special elections. They just lost Miami, they being Republicans, the Republican Party. I don't like to say they because we're all Americans. I will use they invariably, and sometimes I may use it in a critical way, and I apologize for that. I consider us all Americans. We can have disagreements and debates. Sometimes it's hard for me to listen when it's just political, not factual based, not research based, not historical based, and not for the rights of all people. Taxation with representation. Again, the Bill of Rights. Again, liberalism. And if you watch the end of the podcast, I have a little screen that shows you what liberalism means. Freedom of assembly, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, secularism, plurality, things of that nature. So we're going into gerrymandering here. And you can, again, packing and cracking, right? Dilute it or add to it to make sure my guy wins, right or left. This has been going on forever. Again, it used to be based on a census. You do a census and you're like, okay, these districts have changed. Now let's gerrymander. Now what we're doing, California just had a vote to change their constitution for 5 years to gerrymander their state to keep up with what they're doing in Texas to gerrymander. That basically this has become as partisan politics as ever. It's always been there. It's gotten worse. It's power. It's ridiculous. It's undemocratic. So this is taken from of a salamander and Elbridge Gerry, Vice President of the United States until his death, who as governor of Massachusetts in 1812, from 1812. Now, supposedly it happened before that. There was gerrymandering. They didn't call it gerrymandering. And I think it was to keep James Madison from winning state or senator. Anyway, we don't need to really dive into history. The point is, it's named after a guy named Elbridge Gerry, Gerry, in Boston area. And it was compared to the shape of a mythological salamander. Okay, the term has negative connotations, clearly. And gerrymandering is almost always considered a corruption of the democratic process. So why does it exist? I think we can all agree, right and left, this is a corruption of the democratic process. This is voter suppression. This is a violation of the Voting Rights Act. This is basically a violation of Amendment 14, Amendment 15, just the right to vote in general. Instead of putting a poll tax on them, we're just going to reshuffle it. So all the Democrats are in this section, so my Democrat can win again, and we'll just shuffle it because we control the Congress of that state. It's ridiculous. It should be, if you're going to have any sort of thing on this, it should be a completely independent council, which California put in place. I'm not disagreeing with what Newsom did because on the right, they're doing the same thing and just going at it. Still, I don't like the partisan politics, but it should be an independent council. It should only be done on the census. And maybe then it even has to be approved by an independent authority. Or you just write an amendment and say no more gerrymandering. You work together, you figure out the districts, and you're done. And if it goes right, or if it goes left, or if it goes independent, then so be it. The rights of the people. So that's gerrymandering, leads into voter suppression, leads into our amendments. So another quote that I have on the blog is the Gettysburg Address from 1863 during the middle of the Civil War by a liberal Republican. Yes, a Republican. They called him a liberal because the Democrats were conservative at the time. They called him liberal. But he had a team of rivals. He had Republicans and Democrats in his cabinet. Read the book, Team of Rivals by Doris Goodwin Kearns. Not on my website. I don't think, maybe it is, under recommendations for reading. Read it. Great book. The Lincoln Gettysburg Address, I'm just going to summarize. It's obviously a lot longer than this. This nation, that the government of the people by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. The important thing here is not to perish from the earth, to me. Of the people, by the people, for the people. People includes women. Now it includes people, it includes all people when we're talking about voting. Women, any race, 18 and over, any income strata. You need access. You need no suppression. You need no gerrymandering. You do not need a corruption of the democratic process because it is of the people, by the people, and for the people. Okay. So now a lot of people question, there's things that I don't know. I'm not the expert on all politics. A lot of people question the Electoral College history. The Electoral College, how does that work? People see it every 4 years. They see who's going to win, the number of electorates from each state. And then in 2020, 21, of course, we had the fake electorates put together during the January 6th insurrection by Trump and his minions. Ron Navarro involved in that. Rudy Giuliani talking about he got sued about fake voting machines. None of it's been proved. We had a real election, but it came down to getting Electoral College electorates. So each state gives up electorates, meaning that if you win the state, one state, it is based on population, districts, House of Representatives. So remember, the Senate, each state gets 2. So Rhode Island gets as many as Texas, and Texas gets as many as California. All states get 2. Could be both Democrat, could be Democrat, Republican. That's all based on voting, the right to vote. Representatives are represented by the population of the state. So I think it's 538 is the number of electorates there are based on a House of Representatives. So therefore, there are 538 electorates that you can win. So you have to win the majority of those. So you have a majority of those, but it isn't the majority of the vote. So some states do have splits. We'll talk about that. But in general, it's not a majority that wins. So and I'll speak to this. So a state like, let's say Colorado, I don't know how they get, but let's say they get 5. California gets 50. So if you win California by 1 vote, Republican or Democrat, you get 50. You don't get 51%. It can change by state, and we'll talk about some of those options. Okay. So the Founding Fathers established Electoral College in the Constitution, in part as a compromise between the election of a president by a vote in Congress and election of the president by a popular vote of qualified citizens. So one of the options was we vote for senators and representatives, and then every 4 years they vote for the president. One of the options was everybody just votes, and whoever wins the majority of that vote by our votes, the people, not in Congress, wins the election. This is the middle ground. Electoral College does not appear in the Constitution. Is Article 2 of the Constitution and 12th Amendment refers to electors, but not to the Electoral College. So electors. So we actually have electors for each state, and this was the fake elector scheme that was put together by Trump, Ron Navarro, and his administration during the 2020, I'll use Trump's words, the hoax of the stolen election, stop the steal bullshit that caused a seditious and insurrectionist movement to invade Congress. Okay. Since the Electoral College process is part of the original design of the U.S. Constitution, it would be necessary to pass a constitutional amendment to change this system. So Electoral College is there. Are they going to change it to go to popular vote? I don't know that you'd ever get an amendment. I don't know that I would agree with it, but I'll give you the goods and bads. The ratification of the 12th Amendment, the expansion of voting rights, and the state's use of the popular vote to determine who will be appointed as electors has each substantially changed the process. So the process has changed. Okay? Remember, an amendment has to be 2/3 majority in both houses of Congress and ratified by 3/4 of the states. That's a big deal. So one of the things about the electoral process is that the founders wanted to make sure that the mob didn't overrule the minority. Okay? So what that means is if there's 50 states and 49 vote for Trump and one state votes for whoever, let's call it Biden, but that one state has more people than the other 49 and he gets more votes in that, he gets more votes, then Biden would win and you don't get the electorate. So this was a way for the mob, the masses in one state, to win. There are arguments against that. Okay, so you can literally win elections without winning the popular vote. Trump did that against Hillary. Now, Trump won the popular vote against Harris. Biden won the popular vote against Trump. And they won the electoral. But you can win an election without getting the popular vote. So the argument is more people don't want you in, but because of the way the Electoral College, the electorates work, they can still win. Okay? The argument for it is the mob doesn't get to do that. So the states are represented. Okay? Again, any candidate who wins a majority of or plurality of the popular vote nationwide has a good chance of winning in the Electoral College, but there are no guarantees. 1824, 1876, 1888, 2000, Bush v. Gore, and 2016, Trump v. Clinton are examples of when they did not win. So really, other than 2, 4, 5 cases, if you win the electorate, you win the popular. So the argument would be the electorate is working. We're not going to argue whether you should get rid of it. But we need to understand what it means. Now, in some states have different rules and they can split electorates, but most states, let's just assume, we're not going to deep dive on the state issues. We'll have some of that discussion. But in general, just assume if that person wins the state, they get all the electorates from that state. So if it's 5 for Colorado and 1 for Rhode Island and 50 for California and 2 for Alaska based on population, they get them all. It's not necessarily the case, but pretty much in general it is. So in general, it's worked. The point being is the mob actually does win because the people are winning other than 5 times are winning the popular vote and they're winning the electorates. Only 5 times they haven't. Okay. So now we're going to get into some options that differ. So I'm just going to start with one to give us a good example. Open primaries. So an open primary is a primary election that does not require voters to be affiliated with a political party in order to vote for partisan candidates. In a traditional open primary, voters may select one party's ballot and vote for that party's nomination. As in a closed primary, such as those affiliated with a political party may vote, the highest voted candidate in each party then proceeds to the general election. So an open primary, if I'm registered as a Democrat, I don't get to participate in the primaries of a Republican. And if you're a Republican, you don't get to vote in the primaries of a Democrat. I think that's bullshit. In fact, why do you even need to know my party? I'm a voter. So I guess I could put unaffiliated. Now I don't get to vote in either primary. The primary is to put the person in place who then is going to be voted for. That is part of the process of being represented. All primaries should be open. All of them. Now, the argument is, well, then Democrats will flood a Republican primary and make sure someone like, Donald Trump doesn't win, or, Donald Trump doesn't win the primary for the president, or vice versa. Huh. So I don't get to vote for who's going to get to be elected. I only get to vote for the person on my side that possibly could get elected. My side being Democrat, I guess. But I really don't get to vote both ways. That seems tricky. Now, in our political worlds right now, that won't happen in general. Now, a lot of states do this, but at a federal level, it'll never happen because there's just too much partisanship. I don't like it. And what can we do about it? Ranked choice voting can refer to one of the several ranked voting methods used in some cities and states in the United States. Again, open primaries, maybe at the state level. Ranked choice voting, maybe at the state level. At the national level, you're never going to get open primaries for Republicans and Democrats and independents, or what you would call the Progressive Party that Theodore Roosevelt started and did well in 1912 after he left the Republican Party and became a progressive. He basically was one of the founders of the progressive movement in terms of politics. He had some other issues. Ranked choice voting can refer, the term is not strictly defined, but most often refers to instant runoff voting or single transferable vote. The main difference being whether only one winner or multiple winners are elected. Instant runoff voting is used for congressional and presidential elections in Maine, state congressional and presidential general elections in Alaska, and special congressional elections in Hawaii. It is used in all elections in District of Columbia. So this is an option. Okay. So ranked choice is, I have 3 candidates, 1, 2, 3. I rank them and I choice them, and then you would have a runoff, maybe of the top 2. I like the idea at the state level, and I think that should be based on open primaries. So if I'm in a state where there's 5 Republican candidates and 5 Democratic candidates, I should be able to vote on all 10 and rank them, at least at the state level. Most states don't do that. Rank choice, and then you get the top 2, then you have a runoff. They don't do that. What they do is they do closed primaries. If I'm a Republican, I vote for, if I'm an independent, I don't get to vote in either one, which is ridiculous. Now, if there was a third party, let's call it the Progressive Party of Theodore Roosevelt, we would have 3 primaries, but let's say we have 2 primaries, Republican and Democrat. We have ranked choice voting. It would be a closed primary, and then you could have ranked choice voting. And as a Republican, I could go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then the top 2 would run off, and the Democrats. So you could have a ranked choice voting, but still have closed primaries. I don't know that they'll ever go to open primaries with ranked choice voting. I feel like we're restricting. We're at a point where, as a republic, we're only set up for 2 parties, like it or not. People say if you have too many parties, like a banana republic, in a lot of ways, because of our partisan politics and campaign finance law and the restrictions that we're putting in place in gerrymandering, we're already in a banana republic of some sort, right and left. Okay. So just to reiterate here, I want to reiterate the amendments that apply to this. Obviously, the 12th Amendment, which I didn't bring up, which talks about electors, not the Electoral College. That's a new term, but not in the Constitution. That's the 12th Amendment. The 14th Amendment is citizenship and equal protection, birthright citizenship. This is the hot issue right now. States must give due process and equal protection. 15th Amendment, right to vote not denied by race, 1870. The 14th was in 1868, 100 and some years ago. 17, direct election of senators by us, taxation with representation. 19, women's right to vote, 1920. Finally. 22, term limit for presidents, 1951. 23, voting in D.C., residents can vote for president. Crazy, 1961. They couldn't vote for president before that. When are we just going to make it a state? From the right, they'll say, well, that's another Democratic state and electoral. They're a state. 24, abolition of poll tax, 1964. Again, I want everybody to vote. And like I said, the Australian or New Zealand thing, they do penalize if you don't. They get high rates of people voting. So people do pay that tax when they don't vote. High rates, 70% or greater. We get low rates, less than 70% all the time. At smaller elections, less than 50. Vote. 25, presidential succession and disability. Clarifies succession and process if president is incapacitated. It goes to the vice president. It goes to the leader of the House. It goes, if each is incapacitated, goes to the Secretary of State, and then the Secretary of Defense/War. 26, voting age lowered to 18, 1971. So a lot of those kids that fought in Vietnam, the Korean War, World War II, World War I, all the wars intermixed, all the fights that were involved, the Civil War, American Revolution. Of course, that's before we really had the founding. If you went in at 16 or 17, you couldn't even vote. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about here is some things that are important, right? One is education. It's number one. We got to get it out there that it's not an obligation. It is a little bit, sorry. You should be excited about the voting process. Be engaged. I want to know what's happening with my city taxes. I want to know what's happening with my schools. I want to know what's happening with my state's parks. I want to know where my money's being spent. I need to vote. I need to engage. I need access to resources. We have the technology to do it. That's the first and most important thing. Engage. It's not an obligation. It is a freedom that we've been given to vote. The founding of this country, of any republic or democratic country. Vote. We should have a national holiday. The first Tuesday of November when we vote, it should be a national holiday. Now, the right has fought against this vehemently, and probably the left at some point. A national holiday. A lot of people have to work every day. They can't take PTO. We have a terrible PTO or vacation policy. The poor can't take the day off. We have the technology to do mail-in voting. People argue against online voting or automation. We need to figure that out. Everybody that's eligible, that's legal, should vote. And it should be a national holiday once a year. Lobbying. Again, this will come up in another podcast. I'll talk about my thoughts about beyond 2026. We got to get that out of politics or restricted. We got to get gerrymandering out. It's the deconstruction of the democratic process. We need variations of the Voting Rights Act. Maybe they want to limit it, but this country isn't ready, sadly, to say all men are created equal and everybody gets treated equally by those in power, right or left. Mail-in voting, I'm a fan. It's here in Colorado. It's a lot of states. Requirements to vote. I don't believe in a poll tax, so I've come to the conclusion that you can't have a tax on that, right? You can't have it whether it's pay at the poll or pay on your taxes. But good gosh, vote. We need more access to polling stations. That's why we need a national holiday. We need more polling stations. We need public financing. That's required. We have plenty of money. We act like we don't. Again, I'll talk about that in a not project, I don't want to associate it with Project 2025, 2026 and beyond. Other countries have a very sophisticated, Singapore, there's many countries that have a sophisticated method to fund proper voting. Think about the Australia, New Zealand thing, getting people to vote, if they don't pay. There are variations. People need to vote, and they need to have access, and it needs to be easy, and it needs to be legal, and there has to be secure. So more polling stations. If we're not going to automate phone, internet, if some states we don't have mail-in voting, what about people with disabilities, people that have to work? If you're not going to have a national holiday, then the polling stations should stay open. They should be open 2 days. Tuesday and Wednesday. No holiday, 2 days to vote. No mail-in voting, 2 days. No technology, 2 days. How about a day of holiday and a second day of voting? Shit, it doesn't even have to be a paid holiday. Now, most people would need to be paid, because I think it's 40% of people in this country can't afford an unknown $400 bill without borrowing money. They sure in the hell can't afford to take off work to vote. Sadly, that restricts voting. And it restricts voting on who? The poor, that's disabled, the rural. That's limiting taxation with representation. All right. That's all I got. Vote. Please vote. Go to my website. Read the blog. Read those different quotes. Frederick Douglass, Harriet Tubman, Susan B. Anthony, MLK, Martin Luther King Jr., Abraham fucking Lincoln. Of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. All men are created equal. All people are created equal. Women, men, blacks, whites, Asians, Latin America, South America, Central America, Chinese. If you're a citizen of this country, vote. I don't care how you vote. Vote. Participate a little. And I thank you for watching this episode of The Way Left.